Hello everyone, welcome back. If you don't know, we make sewing patterns made especially for drag queens, and today I'm going to show you how to sew our stitched dress pattern with pointed horn hips. Perfect for a Halloween or alternative look. This pattern is made for our unique drag queen sizes from extra small to extra large, however it can be worn by anyone that fits within the size measurements provided. You can download this pattern at katkow.net, part of our Halloween 2025 collection. Let's get started. Once you download and print the pattern, you can assemble the pages. For detailed instructions on printing and assembly, watch this video linked at the top. Once assembled, you should have the following paper pattern pieces. 1 front piece, 1 front 2 piece, 1 front 3 piece which is the underbust, 1 front 4 piece, and 1 front 5 piece. These will be sewn together in sections like so. You will also have a front 6 and a front 7 piece. To create the stitched effect, there is a 1-inch stitch guide included. You can use this guide to mark the fabric wherever you want to add stitch embellishments or overlays. For the back, you will have a back 1 piece and a back 2 piece above the waist, and a back 3 piece and back 4 piece below the waist. You'll also need to create facings, which will overlay the eyelets and grommets area for the center back of back 1 and back 3. For fabric, I'm going to use a non-stretch faux leather in black. However, you can mix and match different tones of faux leather for a nude or skinned look, or even use different shades of green for a Frankenstein look. For this video, we'll be using one solid color. I will note here that this garment will not be lined. This design is intended to have a distressed, raw edge look. However, you can choose to line the dress if you are using a different type of fabric instead of faux leather. Faux leather is more difficult to line unless you add double-folded bias trim around any raw or exposed edges. For notions, you'll need eyelets and grommets, along with a puncture tool to lace up the back of the dress. You'll also need plastic boning that you can sew over. For the stitch embellishment, you'll need a large sharp knitting needle with a wide eye, as well as a heavy-duty thread of your choice to create the visible stitch effect. You will also need a separate lacing cord specifically for the back, which should be different from your stitch embellishment cord. Because we're using faux leather, it's difficult to stack 2 layers of fabric and cut them out at the same time. Instead, cut one piece at a time and then mirror it to create the opposite side. Once your fabric is cut, you should have the following pieces. For all of the front pieces, front 1 through front 7, you should have 2 mirrored pieces for each. The same goes for all of the back pieces, 2 mirrored pieces for each. Additionally, you'll need 2 rectangular facings for the back 1 and 3 pieces. Let's start with sewing. First, stack the front 1 and front 2 pieces with right sides facing each other along this edge, and the front 4 and front 5 pieces along this edge. Then sew them in place using a straight stitch. Once sewn, press or push the excess seam fabric toward the outer side of the garment and top stitch it down. Leave enough room in your top stitching to create a tunnel for the boning between the front 4 and front 5 pieces. Next, attach the front 3 underbust piece to the assembled to the front 1 and front 2 section. Align the top curved notch of the front 3 piece with the seam between front 1 and front 2. Make small clips along any curved edges to help the curves align properly. Once pinned, sew the curved seam in place. You can choose to top stitch this seam if you want, but I prefer to leave the bust area not top stitched. Next, sew the front 4 and front 5 pieces to the bottom edge of the underbust section. Make small clips along the seam allowance to help the curves and notches line up smoothly. Once the pieces are aligned, sew them in place along the bottom edge. After sewing, top stitch the seam fabric downward along the bottom edge of the bust for a clean finish. Repeat the same process for the opposite side. At this point, you can choose to start adding the stitch embellishments along the way. It's easier to add these stitches while working with smaller sections instead of sewing the entire front and back pieces together first. Here's an example of how to create them. Use the 1-inch stitch guide to mark out 2 parallel rows of dots. Then, use your large needle and heavy thread to begin stitching. Start by puncturing the needle through the wrong side of the fabric, making sure your thread has a secure knot at the end. Work in a crisscross motion, passing the needle in and out from the right side to the wrong side. On the right side of the garment, your stitches will appear as horizontal lines only. On the wrong side, the stitches will form angled lines between the dots. Once you've mastered this technique, you can continue adding stitch embellishments along any seams you want throughout the garment. Next, sew the front 6 and front 7 pieces together along this edge, right sides facing each other. Then, top stitch the seam allowance the same way as before. Now, measure and prepare your plastic boning to add above the waist for extra structure. Make sure your boning is about a ½ inch shorter than the total seam length to leave room for stitching at the waist. Melt the ends of the boning or add tape to prevent them from puncturing the fabric. Once the boning is inserted, sew the above the waist sections to the below the waist sections. After sewing, top stitch the seam fabric downward, and repeat this step for the opposite side. At this point, both of your front sides should be complete with added stitch embellishments. Next, sew the 2 completed front sides together along the center front seam. Stack the 2 front panels, right sides facing each other, and sew along the center front. Then top stitch the seam fabric over to one side. You can also experiment with installing a zipper along the center front or even add your lacing eyelets here. Once my front panels are fully assembled, I will add a long stitch embellishment all the way down the center front seam. For the back, start by gathering your back 1 and back 3 pieces along with the rectangular facings. Stack the facings along the center back edge, right sides facing the right side of back 1 and back 3. Sew them together along the center back edge. Once sewn, flip the facings over to the inside of the garment and top stitch them down. Stitch 3 parallel rows along the facings to create tunnels. The first tunnel will be for boning, the middle tunnel should be wide enough for the eyelets, and the last tunnel will hold another piece of boning. Repeat this process for the opposite back 1 piece and the back 3 pieces. Once those are complete, attach the back 2 and back 4 pieces in a similar way to how we assembled the front panels. Then, sew the above the waist back pieces to the below the waist back pieces and top stitch those seams downward. After that, you can add your back stitch embellishments. Then, install your boning into the 2 side tunnels. Next, stack your front and back pieces together with right sides facing each other. Pin or clip along the side seams. Because the hips of this dress are pointed, I'm adding some stabilizer to those areas for extra support. This step is optional, but it helps secure the pointed shape. The stabilizer will be trimmed off later once the seams are sewn. Then, sew the sides and shoulder seams of the front and back pieces together. You can then trim off away any excess stabilizer. Next, because I'm going for a raw edge look, I'm going to mark the seam allowance around the neckline. I'll trim off this seam allowance for a raw edge finish. If you plan to add a lining instead, you'll want to keep the seam allowance here so you can attach the lining. Next, use the 1-inch stitch guide to mark where the eyelets will be placed along the back edges. Then, use your eyelet and grommet tool to add the eyelets evenly along the entire center back. The lacing cord you use for the center back should be sturdier and stronger than the thread used for the embellishment stitches. You'll need a long length of cord since the back edge is quite tall. To measure, I start by estimating the space between each eyelet, then pull extra length to account for the loops needed to tie up the back securely. I also leave additional length so you can get into the dress. Once measured, cut the cord and duplicate that exact length to create a second string. Tie the two cords together at one end with a secure knot. Insert the knotted end through the wrong side of the bottom eyelets to anchor the cord in place. Then begin lacing by weaving the cord under and over, creating a crisscross X pattern up the center back. Continue this under-over motion until you reach the middle of the back. At the middle point, form 2 bunny loops on each side of the lacing. These loops are what you'll use to tighten and loosen the dress later. I also like to add small clips at this stage to keep the loops in place. Continue lacing in the same under-over pattern until you reach the top of the garment. At the top, direct the cords inward toward the back, then tie them together with a secure knot to finish the lacing. The cord I used was a little more textured, which made it slightly harder to adjust, but if you choose a smoother cord, it should slide and tighten more easily. Lastly, I decided to top stitch around the hip point area to help keep that shape sharp. I also added top stitching along the armholes, neckline, and bottom hem of the dress to prevent any excess fraying. And just like that, your stitched dress with pointed hips and a fully laced up back is complete. Feel free to experiment with different fabrics, textures, and embellishments to make it your own. Please tag us in your creations at Katkow on Instagram and TikTok. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more drag queen sewing patterns and tutorials.